the Powell side. She married my grandfather, and I was just going to ask Whitney. Uh, I can't think of his name now, but anyway, he's the choir director.
Rodney?
Rodney. I was going to ask him, my great grandmother's last name was Whitley, and I was just wondering where his family is from, and that's it.
My family is from Zebulon, well, on the Whitley side, Zebulon, North Carolina.
Okay. All right. I was just curious.
Thank you for sharing, Brother Powell. If anyone else would like to share, we invite you to unmute your microphone. I see Brother Warren. Brother Warren, would you go ahead and share, please?
Good evening, Mount Olive. My family and I are at a crossroads because we have not seen birth certificates that document where our grandparents are from on both sides. So we're in the dark, recognizing that there's always a miss or a misinterpretation of who are your relatives, who are not. The other concern is we realize that history does not record specifically going back possibly 3 or 4 generations, and it's a void. So I want to jump into the void so that I can clarify this for my clan or my offspring.
Thank you. That's very helpful to know.
I'll add something. This is Rosemary. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Sister Rosemary.
Okay. I joined to talk about genealogy. I've been dealing with working on genealogy since I was about 15 years old, so that's been about 50 years. Have always been one of those people that sat down at the feet of old people and listening to what they had to say about their lives. And so I've traced a lot of our history back just before the Civil War. We do have Native American. I believe it's Creek, and I believe it's from South Carolina. We have documents from the World War II registration where the 2 brothers, my great-grandfather and his brother both had draft registrations where they identified themselves as half Native American. And so the main thing I'm really interested in, on one side of the family, there is an older man that was born in 1835. That's as far back as I've gotten. And he actually owned land before the Civil War, several hundred acres. And so I am just trying to find and understand what that story is. That actually, and it was in Florida. We are from Florida, back through the Civil War. I found where we have Native Americans in the family, and I've actually traced them where they were actually fighting for, get this, the Confederacy. And I actually did historically find out that a lot of the Native tribes did fight for the Confederacy because they were mad with the Union because they had reneged on treaties. So anyway, so I'm very interested in genealogy, and so there's some holes and stuff that I was sort of hoping that maybe there's some information that would help trace some of that stuff down.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Rosemary, for sharing. We have room for one more, and then we will move on. And of course, we will have time for questions and answers a little bit later in our presentation. I saw Sister Carol Robinson Huntley has her hand raised. Sister Carol, would you like to share?
Hi, good evening. In completing the Reclaiming Our Story homework, if you will, I was sort of startled and surprised at myself that I did not know where my grandparents, their place of birth. I knew where they grew up, but I'm not sure of their place of birth, if they were born at home or due to segregation, if they were born in DC. I know we're all from Arlington. My ancestry goes back to Arlington House, where we were slaves for George Washington Parke Custis, but I'm not certain as to, I was sort of like, wow, I really don't know where my grandparents were born. and particularly on my father's side. My father's 93, and we've talked about where he's from, but we've never talked about a birthplace. So I will follow up on that. Hope to be able to learn something from this training.
Thank you so much, Sister Carol, and thank you for all that have shared. Sister Adrienne, it's back to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all that. That was a nice variety of why we're here. So I'd like to dive in to my why, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit more in my presentation. You're going to see some of my why in my slides, but like many of you, I've been doing genealogy for many years. My reasons have evolved as to why I continue to do genealogy, but in the beginning, for me, it was to understand very basic family information. Who I learned at the age of 10 that my biological father, the person I was growing up with, was not my biological father. So that was a little jarring and shocking as a 10-year-old. But nonetheless, I had an amazing family, parents, and stepfather. And so that was really the key thing that led me to genealogy, learning more about my biological paternal heritage. Some reasons I do genealogy today is to reconcile my past ancestors much further back now that I understand my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. And also because I don't like being lumped into a single narrative. I don't like the all Black people came from story, or all people or all Americans are like this. And so I feel it's important for all of us. This is I think why we should all be doing this, is so that nobody can put you in that box of all Black people. You have a unique story, your ancestors have a unique story, and we should be telling that story. They have a unique place in American or history, or wherever they were in the history of that place. I also do this, my other why is for reparations. That's another big reason I think that today we're getting closer to. I think you guys there on the Upper East Coast are seeing universities start to acknowledge their part in having slave labor, selling slaves, enslaved people, excuse me. And so now they're trying to make amends. And the road to making amends, or for individuals like us who may have come from enslaved people, is to have our genealogy together so we can prove that we did come from certain people who served in certain capacities. And that could be military, enslaved labor, et cetera. And the other reason that's less common is for lineage societies. This was not mentioned, maybe it's in my bio, I can't recall, but I am a member of several lineage societies: Daughters of the American Revolution, Daughters of Union Veterans of the Civil War, Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage, which is newer and honors enslaved ancestors. So those are some whys. Some people may not be, might not be on your radar yet, but that might be of interest for you, because in lineage societies, there are scholarship opportunities and opportunities to learn about our ancestors and their shared military service or lives with other people who can relate and connect to that. So now I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to dive into my presentation. And see. Okay, so the presentation I'm doing for you guys is in your Reclaiming Our Story theme and narrative, is one that I give often, and I title my presentation The State of African American Genealogy, and with a subtitle, A New Reconstruction Era. And I focus on Reconstruction because a lot of my professional research is in the lower South, in the deep South, and in the upper South as well. But I use it figuratively in the sense that today's genealogy, we are reconstructing and putting our families back together, and after being severely cut off at that time, prior to emancipation, after emancipation. Now we're able to reconstruct them, and we're doing this with genealogy. And throughout this presentation, we're going to learn how we're doing that and what tools are available to us. So I'm going to introduce you to a few people in my family that are, again, my why I do research. See, there we go. I do this because it's an existential question. It answers that for me. I am here because of them. This is my maternal great-grandmother, Louise King. She was born in 1900 in Yazoo County, Mississippi, and died in Chicago, Illinois. I am because of William Fisher Johnson. He's my paternal 2 times great-grandfather. Also, he was born in Arkansas, but then he died in Mississippi. I have a lot of Mississippi roots here. I am because of James Andrew Moffett. He is my maternal great-grandfather. He was born in 1894 in Jefferson County, Mississippi, and in 1957, he died. A few years back, a different Adrian would not have shared James Moffett with you, but that's kind of part of my personal journey, is acknowledging all of the ancestors, if you will. I am because of Sarah Ledbetter. She's my maternal 4th great-grandmother, born in 1807, Jefferson County, Mississippi, and died sometime after 1860 in Jefferson County, Mississippi. And I am, or they are, because of me. I do this because I have 2 children, and I want to share history and pass that down onto them. So that's another big why. Okay, what makes genealogy hard? Some of the concepts we're going to cover in this first night tonight are going to seem very basic, but they're actually very high level, if you ask me personally, because we need to consider our why, and we need to consider our family members' why, and kind of try to find a place for collaboration, because genealogy, if you're going to be successful, is really going to depend on how collaborative it is amongst people. So when you're interviewing relatives, when you're collecting information, when you're trying to get records, collaboration is vital. So I put several words here on the screen because these are our roadblocks. Our why might be different. I want to get back to Africa. I don't care about anything else. Meanwhile, you're interested only in your indigenous ancestors. Your research focus might be different than someone else's. Your feelings about genealogy might be different than someone else's. I mean, my dad doesn't like it. I had an aunt who didn't, I wasn't going to get anything out of her. People feel shame. I did for years. I didn't want to talk about European ancestors. I pushed them far to the side. That was a place of shame for my family. That was not a celebratory place for me. And I had to work through that. So if you had tried to collaborate with me years ago about those ancestors, I probably wouldn't have been interested. What else makes genealogy hard? People are worried about privacy. Some people feel that my mom and dad's name is private information, and you don't need to know that. Well, a lot of records are public, and professional genealogists like myself can obtain those if we needed to. Secrets make genealogy hard, lies, judgment. If you're an outside child, I mean, for example, or you were born to a mother out of wedlock. I was that person, and personally, I didn't like feeling like a skeleton in someone's closet, because I'm not. I was a child, and I arrived here, and all of those things. So we need to consider those things when we're working with other family members and trying to collaborate in our shared family history journey. Okay. Getting started. African American genealogy is often considered very challenging. Usually after the 1870 brick wall, but it's not impossible. And I find that a lot of people have challenges even prior to that for some of the reasons on that other screen. Lack of information, misinformation, not being told the right stuff. Things go on vital records incorrectly. Later on, further in the presentation, like 2 weeks from now or a week or so from now, you'll see my grandfather's birth certificate, which says a man named Tom Wilson is his father, and that is a lie. But when we're getting started, what we want to do, we want to start with what you know. Mom and dad, grandma, grandpa, where they were born, when they were born. Conduct family history interviews with relatives, prepare for many inaccuracies in oral narratives as well as record evidence. Understand African American family history research is not necessarily straightforward. We'll get to that too. And we want to develop an understanding of the FAN network. And what that means is our friends, family, associates, and neighbors that our family members knew and dealt with and frequented with. And as a genetic genealogist, I have to throw it out there, we're going to consider DNA testing to take our research further and to make it slightly more accurate, right? So I will say I have a bias towards DNA. It has helped me overcome a lot of things, and I won't go in depth with it, but we will consider it and touch on it. Okay, conducting family oral history interviews. This is where family history really should start, and it should actually be a little bit more natural than this. We don't usually sit down with our relatives. It's just more fluid. We're in the house. We grew up with this person who we knew as our mom. We grew up with this person who we knew as our dad, or maybe extended family. I spent some time at my grandmother's house, and my uncle and an aunt lived there as well. So I just knew that through common knowledge of my mother sharing that with me. I didn't really have to interview her for that. But as we start wanting to tighten up our family history and maybe record it on paper or documents, we might want to do a more formal family history interview. So the very basics: what is your full name? Do you have any nicknames? Very important. A lot of people, I'll ask about their family when I'm starting to help research, and they don't know their relative's real name at all. And that makes it very difficult because nicknames usually don't go on documents. When were they born and where were they born? Did they have siblings? Understanding siblings, very important because they are part of the FAN network or collateral lines in our research. And then if you're interviewing your parents or grandparents or whoever you're interviewing, you're basically going to put these questions on repeat. So what were their parents' names? Did they have nicknames? Where were they born? When and where, and if where they passed to, if they're no longer with us. We want to avoid yes or no questions. A fun question that was asked of me at a conference was, if a movie was made about your life, what genre of movie would it be? And I said a musical. And the people interviewing everybody laughed because no one had said musical up to that point. And for me, that was because growing up in my household, there was always music playing. My parents had card parties and were very social, and they would always have music playing. And so I just, my life would be an upbeat kind of musical. But that's not the same for everyone. And again, we have to remember, some people might find their family to be a comedy, a horror film, etc. We want to ask, we want to encourage conversation to come naturally. So again, that's where the best information comes from. And you can use a recorder, record on your phone or something like that to take this information down and then transcribe it later. But you really want to give the person you're interviewing an opportunity to feel comfortable when they're sharing information. And these are just some questions I just randomly made up. But I think also, instead of just focusing on the positive too, we do want to try to ask hard questions. How did your family overcome hardship is one way to kind of position talking about difficult moments in family history. We want to build robust family narratives. Depending on where you are in your research journey or what your interest is. Some people will come to me, for example, for research, and they'll want to just build their trees back, their family trees back, and their pedigree as far back in time as possible. So they're capturing the names, they're capturing the dates and the place of birth and the place of death, but they're really may not be interested at that time in capturing the little details about their lives. And if you're, let's use a grandparent, for example. If you're interviewing someone about your grandparent, it could be your parent, you know, and you're asking them questions about them or a great aunt or a cousin or anybody, interview multiple individuals about the same person or event. I only grew up with one sibling in the house with me. My mother came from a family of 6 children. When I speak to my mom and her siblings about their parents, some of the stories are very different. Some of the feelings are very different, from the oldest to the baby in the family. We want to build robust stories. We want to capture information about our family's lives, because some of us will not be able to take our trees far back, or a portion of our tree super far back in time. So I think this is a really nice way to really just bring life to them and not just capture names and dates and places. If you don't have anyone available to ask information about your grandparent or great-grandparent, gather information about the community they lived in. Did they live in the city? Did they live in the country? What's the population size? What was the demographics of that population? And understand important events that took place during their lifetime. The person is living, ask them what they remember about it. If the person is deceased, seek firsthand accounts provided by people within their communities. Newspapers are a good source for that. Okay, in the oral family history, and we're going to talk about this more with records as well, consider the source. That picture is me when I was about 7 years old in my grandmother's backyard. The story I'm about to share didn't happen on that day, but for instance, one day my brother and I were playing hide and go seek out there. My brother was about 5, and again, I was probably 6 or 7, and a man jumps over this concrete fence you see pictured behind me, and he dashes through the yard, and then he leaps over the fence again. And then shortly after him, the police are in with guns pointed, and there I am. And now I'm the person here to ID their bad guy. So at 7 years old, and my mother had come out by that time, but at 7 years old, there were things I didn't know. And they asked, what was he wearing? You know, I said, gray slacks, a red shirt that looked like a Hawaii shirt. And then they said, well, what race was he? I had never been taught race at that point. I lived in a very predominantly Hispanic neighborhood, and I didn't know. And so my mom had to use 3 people that we knew, Tony, Joe, and Eric, and to ask, you know, what does this man look like? And he looked like my uncle's friend, which allowed them to know that he was Hispanic. But the point of this is, consider the source of information. When we get oral history from relatives, sometimes we're getting it from them from a memory of when they were 7, 8, 9, or 10 years old as a child. Those details might look a lot different 60 years later in their minds. You have people who will say things about like, well, my grandmother would have never done that, or I know for a fact she wasn't doing this thing, or she didn't give a child away in the community. Well, I mean, I don't know what my grandmother was doing, quite honestly, in 1999. You know, I don't know that. I was a child. So, but what I found is people take oral history really to heart. You know, those who have spent and were fortunate to spend a lot of time listening to their elders. It's not to say that it's not credible, but we do want to just consider a few things. Firsthand knowledge versus secondhand knowledge. I mean, our name, our place of birth, and our birth date is all secondhand knowledge for every single one of us because someone's told it to us. That's not something that's firsthand knowledge except to the parent, the mother, right? Or anybody else who may have been there at the time of that person's birth. Think of the age of that person providing the information. Are they a child? Are they, advanced in age, feeble in the mind? What might skew some of the details of their story? And then let's consider their perception and biases as well. So those are important things when we're collecting oral family history that we need to consider. Okay. Once you've collected and you've had some homework prior to this time to focus on some of these things, and we're going to get some more homework at the end of this session. But with that information where I was asking your 4 grandparents and where they were born, I think a lot of you are familiar with what a pedigree looks like, but let's put it on a pedigree. You can Google this, download one, put it on paper, write it in. But and this is a good way to see how much information you have, what gaps are there in your family tree, and where you might want to focus your research effort first. So for example, this is a site I use named DNA Painter. I have family trees on Ancestry and Family Search and all kinds of other places that we'll talk about later. But for this one, what I like, they give me like nice visual tools of, okay, you've got all 4 of your grandparents, you've got 8 of your great grandparents, and all 16 of your great great grandparents are named. And the further back it goes, I haven't captured all that information, but put it on paper, put it in a pedigree. Let's see where the gaps are if you don't already know, or if there's information you are just unsure of, okay? And record research. We're not going to dive into this tonight because the focus was on oral history as a starting point, focusing on our whys and our feelings towards genealogy and understanding that a lot of those things like judgment and shame and guilt and trust issues and just having a different research goal will hinder collaboration, if you will. So keep that in mind. And when we open this back up for questions, I would love to hear from individuals who may have experienced one of those roadblocks and if they overcame that. But for moving ahead, once we get started in record research, what some of the things you'll want to know and why do you need record evidence? Well, records are used for many things. I mean, and they're created for many reasons, right? But for instance, if you in genealogy research, if you wanted to confirm the names of parents, just when dates of birth, place of birth, burial information, these things can be found on birth, marriage, death records, all kinds of records and we'll touch on the various kinds, the newspapers and obituaries and things like that. What records will you need? It depends on the research question you're trying to answer to determine which records you'll want and need. For me, having joined lineage societies, you want birth, marriage, and death records for every generation possible if you can. But that's not always possible depending on where you might be located and for various reasons. We'll cover repositories where records are held. There are many records that are online, but state by state, some records might not be available digitally online yet, and you might have to order those records, or they might be closed for the next 100 years. They might have a 100-year policy, and those records are not public information until after 100 years. So we'll talk about how to obtain some of those records, and hopefully you'll know how to do some of this already, and this will be a refresher, but then hopefully we'll capture a few things that are new information as well. So let's see here. That concludes the first session for tonight. Just some food for thought, planting some seeds as we work on reclaiming our story. I believe your homework is going to go out via email as well, but I just want to touch on that. So understanding the basics of family research, you're going to, for this week, I would like you to come back next week with a research question that you constructed for maybe an ancestor, one or two that you're interested in researching during this session. And with that, we try to keep research questions just very narrow and focused to begin with. So where were my grandparents born? And, you know, and then identify them by my grandmother was the wife of so-and-so, and she lived in this county in North Carolina. I would like for you to try to compile all the documents already available to you for that ancestor and see what you have, see what you would need to locate. Do you have birth records for them, marriage records, death records? And identify those gaps in that information, and we'll develop research plans. So this is stuff, if you have questions, we'll work through them through the course of this. But for this coming week, I'd like you to just kind of think about an ancestor, someone you're just really curious to know a little bit more about, and we'll continue our journey from there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And we'll open it back up for questions. And again, this is just a thinking kind of thing, because genealogy, in my experience, is difficult. I'll tell you, as a professional researcher, a lot of times I spend doing damage control for my clients. I'll have clients who will reach out to me and they'll say, nobody ever writes back to my messages on Ancestry, and I don't understand why they don't know anything or why they don't say anything. And for instance, I have a cousin who, he always thinks they know, but they won't tell you. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes people really don't have information about their families. So these are things just to keep in mind, because if you're sending messages to matches or family members or someone you've come across, or you've written a letter and you suspect they know something, and there's that tone in your letter, that might change the direction of your research drastically. So knowing how to communicate, knowing their why, ask them, would you be interested? Why? If you know they're interested in family research, see if they're on the same page. And then that'll help you with collaborating and opening up good dialogue for learning more about your ancestors. Okay.
So Adrienne, can you do something for me as people are thinking of their questions? And we are going to open up the floor for questions. And so if you have a question, we just ask, again, that you look at the bottom of your screen, push the reactions button, and you will see where it says raise hand. If you click on that, that will allow you to pop up at the top of our screen so we can see who's raising their hand and who has the question. And I'll call on you. And we ask that you would keep your questions, straight to the point so that everyone has an opportunity to ask a question with the time that we have left. But while you guys are thinking of your questions, Adrienne, can you give us like a highlight of how our journey is going to progress, like throughout the weeks? Like when this series is over, what can people, hopefully, what is the opportunity for them to kind of leave this session and this journey with?
Yes. So for today, like I said, we're just thinking, brainstorming, finding what information we don't have and we're surprised to not know it or not have it, finding and identifying the gaps, learning what questions we need to ask, maybe interviewing relatives if we haven't already, talking. These can be siblings, if they're not parents or grandparents. So there's that. Then we're going to move to record research evidence. We're going to talk about different types of records you'd want to use. And again, people, I have to collect records as a professional, but others might just be comfortable writing names on a sheet of paper. So records might not be that interesting, but they are important to the research and proving lineage, if that's something you need to do for several reasons. You might want to do that. So we'll focus on just documentary evidence in the second week. And then in the third week, we're going to discuss like overcoming the 1870 brick wall, which is where a lot of African-American people tend to get stuck. So what are some of the resources, new record collections that are available for that? Again, depending on where your ancestors are from, in what state, some states are going to be better than other states. And that's just, you know, if your county had a lot of burned counties in Georgia or something like that, or courthouses burned down repeatedly, we're not going to have a lot of luck with that research. But fortunately, there are other options and avenues. In the fourth week, we're going to talk about building out your story some more. So now that we have been collecting oral family history, we've maybe gotten some documents online, offline, or put in an order for some of those documents. We'll have those records to use as evidence of information for where our ancestors came from. And also to just take us back further in time. And then we will also, with that building out your story, we'll talk about how you'll want to share your research, what that looks like. Is it online or offline, and different ways of sharing it with your family members? Because why are we doing this? If we're not doing it to share, hopefully we're sharing the research effort.
Thank you so much. So if anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand at this time. If you're having problems raising your hand, if you wave your hand, hopefully we'll see you. Okay, we have a question from Janice Worrell. If you could unmute your microphone so we can hear you.
Hi, my name is Janice Burrell. My question is, the reason why I'm so interested in genealogy is because my mother's mother, I was told, lived on a plantation. And me as a child, I didn't know what a plantation was. Recently found out as we got older. And they also told us that even though all of us are, they said a Black race, but I found out that my mother's mother was an Indian. So all of us don't come from Black, we come from Indian too. And I remember her hair being down her back, long hair beautiful than what I ever seen. And she began to tell me about being an Indian. I was having this conversation with her. I thought she was Black, you know what I'm saying? So I would like to know what type of Indian she was. And they also told us that even though you lived on a plantation, the name that they had, their last name, was not their real name. They said that they had to take on the master's name of the plantation that they were on. You didn't even have a name, wasn't allowed to keep a name, your last name. So I also would like to find out what was their real name, or if they had real names. You know what I'm saying? Like we see on the roots. Was their nickname used to identify them with their real name or the mother and father's name? So I would like to know the truths in that. And so that I'm very interested because of that. I feel like I owe that to the little girl that talked to my grandmother as an Indian to really know what really happened.
Right. I definitely can relate to that and understand that. And I think we'll cover some of it, or how do you find a name and how do you know it was their name, you know, and it wasn't just given a name, because as I mentioned on the records, sometimes there are lies, misinformation. And on my grandfather's record, for example, because he was born in segregated Mississippi in 1924, They weren't going to put a white man's name on his record. So they put fictitious Tom Wilson, the Black Railroad hand, on his birth record. And as a result of that, my mother became a Wilson. I took my mother's maiden name when I was born, so I became a Wilson, but Wilson is a fictitious name for us. It means nothing. It has no history. It goes no further back than my grandfather and his sister, who for some reason got that name as well. But really, biologically, he was a Moffat. So you have the record evidence saying he's this. The whole community and the whole town knows that's James's son. He's a Moffat. The whole community knows it. That's oral history from the community.
Wow.
And then now that we have DNA evidence, I was several years ago now, I drove to Natchez, Mississippi, and I had a nephew take a DNA test, a white man who claimed my grandfather as his uncle. And so, yeah, that's Uncle Bubba, I know him. So what's in a name? We are looking at records, we're looking at names. You know, some of them will go far back. Some of them will only just carry over a couple of generations. Some people have their mother's names and not their father's names. I was one of those people. I mean, I could talk a lot about finding true names. You know, we'll touch on that some more and what records and all this evidence that we're collecting can tell us.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a question from Brother Rodney Whitley.
Sister Adrian, we're delighted that you're sharing with us tonight, and this is really helpful information. Can you share, certainly many people who are watching us on all of our streaming platforms are excited about what you're sharing, and they're going to want to, jump off of this Zoom call or this broadcast tonight and really want to start. Can you give us those, if you had to sum up 5 or 6 quick things of someone who's just eager to start, what is the beginning of that start look like?
Looks like I said, it's computer, sheet of paper, smartphone, whatever you have. And those questions that I asked, naming your parents, their place of birth, their date of birth. The other thing about genealogy, a lot of people do is they make it harder than it has to be. Okay, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to put these steps on repeat. Every generation, we're going to put these steps on repeat. We want to compile that information. So if you want to keep it inexpensive, because it does get expensive doing genealogical research, like I said, you can go online. You can download a pedigree chart. I recommended a book. I'm not sure if it was shared, but this is a nice workbook, and it might be hard to see it, but it's called the Family Tree Workbook by Brian Sheffy, and it has 30 step-by-step worksheets to help you build your family tree. So if you want a nice, organized means of compiling information, that's one way. Like I said, everybody has their different strategies, computer or handwriting or whatever. Names, dates of birth, place of birth, etc. Put it on repeat and just keep going further back in time with every ancestor. Okay, who were my parents' parents? Who were their parents? Where were they born? And then as you go along, you may be interested in knowing a little bit more than that. So you may want to start looking up newspapers, just filling in some more details about them. How would you do that? Again, if we want to keep this inexpensive, you could use a website called FamilySearch.org, which is maintained by the Church of Latter-day Saints. And there's tons of census records available on there. There's tons of vital records available. I saw Alabama a lot on the spreadsheet you sent, and I saw a lot of people have roots there. I love Alabama research because they have some of the best marriage records, that better than Mississippi, where my family is from. So I'm envious. But FamilySearch.org is where you would want to go if you want to start diving into looking at records and what's available online for free. I don't necessarily recommend building a tree on there, which you can do, and you can do it for free. because it is an open tree and they link it to other people and it can get out of hand. So I don't necessarily recommend that for now. We'll talk about that more later when we're building out our story and where we want to put it. But that's really it. If you're really ready to get started now, put it on that pedigree.
And one follow-up question: how easy or difficult when you get into the crux of it, as far as vital records? You know, we watch Brother Gates go to many libraries in different places that we watch on television, and there's a library of wealth of information. How difficult or easy is it to visiting the local towns and communities to search for that information?
To visit, was that what the question was? Or
well, like, for instance, whether it's downtown in the state in which you live, how
Right.
difficult it is to find the vital records, ask for an appointment, go in looking for my grandmother.
Yeah, that's going to vary by place to place and who's working there and how helpful they want to be. But usually I find in most places that, because I do a lot of research, I'm calling different Wisconsin, for example, and I'm asking the Register of Deeds, how do I order their death records? They're not available online. Sometimes there'll be cheaper options. Sometimes people will go directly to the state when maybe they need to start at the county level and it'll be cheaper. So we'll talk about that as we talk about what repositories and places to look into, but that's really just going to depend on where a person is from and the access of certain records available to them.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Brother Rodney. And for those that are watching us and joining in via YouTube and our church's live stream, we invite you to use the comment section to ask questions as well. And we are so grateful that you have joined us. Someone asked the question, what is the name of the book that Adrian mentioned? And again, that's Family Tree Workbook by Brian Chaffee. If you registered for this series via Zoom, then all of that information, as well as the homework pre-assignment for tonight, was in that email. And so if you are watching via YouTube or watching via our church's website and you want to connect with us on Zoom and be a part of the live interactive discussion, we invite you to go to our church's website to register. Our church's website is www.mtolivebc.org. And at the top of the screen, you'll see web banner where you will see our Reclaiming Our Story series for Black History Month. And so we ask that you click on that and you can register and join us here next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But if you're coming on Zoom, we ask you to get on a little bit early before we go live. And so it is 7:57. Do we have one more question? And for those that are posting on Facebook and YouTube, we will get to your questions next week if you have them. And so we want to thank you all so much for sharing with us. We pray that you learned something and you were challenged and you're ready to start this work of reclaiming our story. We know that because Pastor Victor actually shared at the end of Bible study last Wednesday, talking about the different types of trauma we have experienced. It has caused us to be in some ways divorced from some of our stories and some of the knowledge and some of the names. And so we look forward to this journey of reclaiming some of that, finding the strength in that and how God has been leading us and guiding us through. So we have one last question. Sister Janet Victor, if you could unmute yourself, please.
Okay, this is a question to Adrian. Are you, and it might get a little personal. If it is, it's, okay. But are you on 23andMe?
Yes, I am.
Okay, seems to me, and I recognize your name now, but do you recall us connecting together maybe a year or two ago?
I don't, but I mean, I'm happy to reconnect if we are cousins.
I think we are. I can't find, I'll have to go back and do some looking to see exactly where we are in that lineage there. But I recall when I saw that name pop up, I said, I've seen that name before. And I think, it might have been, what is this, 22? It might have been like 217, 218. So if you got records from back then, I'm going to look to see if I got mine, because I saved mine. And I think, I'm pretty sure that we connect as cousins somewhere, fourth, fifth, somewhere down there.
Oh, that would be great. I love that. And I'm gonna, as soon as we log off, I'm gonna go look for you, like in my results. So
okay, it will be the name will be Janet, the way it's on the 23andMe, Janet Louise Beverly, which was my maiden name, Victor.
Okay.
Outstanding. We're grateful for the new connection that was made tonight. So for those of you who are watching on Facebook and YouTube, if you do not receive emails from Mount Olive, we ask that you go on the website, scroll down to the bottom and click on connect to us so that you can receive our weekly emails with our homework assignments that we will receive throughout this series. And so we want to say good night and God bless you. And we look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday at 7 p.m. as we continue to reclaim our story.